started. We have just a couple softball questions. I'd like your attention, folks. That's all right. It's all right. I wanted to, and if you don't mind, Dr. Beabout, I'll just address this directly to you. And if anybody else wants to chime in, that's fine. But can we start off with a working definition of philosophy and then go from there?
Sure. The word is Greek. It comes.
Oh yes, sorry.
Yep.
Thanks. The word philosophy is Greek. It's made of two words. The first part, philo, is love. Now there are several different words for love in Greek, right? Eros, like our word erotic, that kind of attraction. Agape, like self-giving love, right? But philo is a kind of love where there's a yearning and a longing. It can be a kind of brotherly love, but so the first part is just love, but love in the sense of seeking. The second part is Sophie, is like Sophia. Earlier in the day, I mentioned the word Sophia, right, is wisdom. Right? So philosophy is literally the love of wisdom. I would characterize it as the seeking to understand the underlying principles of everything using reason and experience. Right? We like to think of ourselves as the oldest academic discipline. As a matter of fact, the word academic comes from Plato's Academy. Right? So we're like the oldest academics there are philosophers. And our discipline has had a very, very long history and a long encounter with Christianity. Sometimes friendly, sometimes unfriendly, but always vital and alive. So.
Very good. And would the rest of the panelists agree with that definition, or do you have anything to add to it?
I'll add a couple of things. The philosophy actually founded the university. And in fact, what Dr. Beabout just mentioned, Plato's Academy, was the very first known university. And Aristotle started the second one, actually, who was Plato's student. And so without philosophy, we wouldn't have the university today. In fact, it defined the history of the university for centuries. I would add, too, I always like to mention Plato's definition of wisdom, since wisdom is a part of the word philosophy, philia sophia, right, as Dr. Beabout just explained. Plato understands by wisdom a knowledge of the whole, a kind of big picture knowledge, if you will, that doesn't deal with really specific questions about, how to put together a bookshelf, or why do wolves act the way they do, or, even a question like, how did Donald Trump become president, or something like that, right? I mean, it asks those big questions. What does it mean to be a human being? What is the ultimate purpose of a human being? What is the ultimate purpose of a political body? And things of that sort. And so it's an essential kind of knowledge to have when it comes to putting together all the other kinds of knowledge that we can get, okay? And so, I just wanted to add those couple of things.
I'm sure you've all heard of Socrates, right? Have you heard that name? Yeah. Sometimes thinking about the personality of Socrates can be really helpful. He noticed something, which is that people know things, farmers and politicians, and they have knowledge, but oftentimes we claim to have knowledge that we don't. And so when he would run into people and have conversations, they would say, he'd say, well, why are you doing what you're doing? And they would give some reason. They'd appeal to some principle, like it's because it's just, or because it's holy. And he would say, well, what is holiness, right? Do we know what these terms mean when we appeal to them as a basis for our action? Is holiness some standard God has to live up to, or is it a standard he makes up? What is it, right? And so you start thinking deeply about these questions. And Socrates called himself a midwife. And I really like that term because I had 2 babies at home with a midwife, and so I know all about midwives. And one thing thank you, it was a big accomplishment. I'm very proud. But one thing that was interesting is the midwife was there, and my father came in and said, "Thank you so much for delivering my grandson." And she said, "Don't thank me, thank her," right? And she pointed to me. Why? Because who delivered the baby? Me, not her. She just gave me some pointers. And so Socrates called himself a midwife because he utilized a series of questions so that you could give birth to the answer yourself, right? As opposed to just telling you. And you all know how it is when you sit and listen to a lecture and you go, "What did I just learn?" Right? It's a little different from having a lively discussion, right? Where you discover something for yourself. So that's part of the philosophical process as well. And we call that the Socratic method.
Check. Yeah, I don't really have much to add to this. I would maybe jump off of what Dr. Beabout said when he spoke of first principles. One of the ways that I introduce philosophy in my classes here at Lindenwood is with a simple definition of critical reasoning about ultimate questions. And then we spend some time getting clear on what I mean by ultimate. So you, the class clown here, what's the question we ask in biology? What's the main question they're wanting to know in biology? Have any ideas? Anybody? What kind of question do we ask in biology? Let's just pick a normal science here. Yes? Yeah, that might be a little closer to what we do in philosophy. Maybe what we'd say in biology is, how do living things work, right? And we go out and we study those, right? Say in physics, the physicist will ask, how does the physical world work? Or a psychologist, if you take a psychology class when you get to college, the professors there will be concerned with asking how the human mind works. Or an anthropology class, how do human beings work in culture and society? So if you notice, all of those questions, those are necessary for you to even do those sciences, right? Can you imagine going to your first day of class in psychology or biology, and when the professor says, "We're going to study biology in this class, and we're going to ask how living things work," and you raise your hand and say, "What does it mean to be alive?" Get the hell out of here, right? Or in your first day of your physics class, they'll love this. What does it mean to be physical? Right? Everybody knows what it means to be physical, right? Or in your psychology class, what's it mean to have a mind? What's it mean to be mental versus physical? What is humanity, right? So you notice how all of those questions that are there in the sciences, that's why philosophy has the sort of level of importance that Dr. Carper and Dr. Beabout are speaking about, right? You want to ask the questions that are more ultimate, more foundational, fundamental to all the other sciences. What comes along with that is that we get the ability to organize all the knowledge together. That's what the university is all about. So, yeah, I think that's all I want to add. Thanks.
Dr. Steineger, Ph.D., Run DMC. Check, baby, check, baby. Sorry, I just had to do that.
They're not old enough to know that.
The only thing I'd add is Chesterton described philosophy as thinking that's been thought out. And he said the only alternative to thinking that's been thought out is thinking that hasn't been thought out. Which means that if you're thinking, you're doing philosophy. And you've heard mentions of biology and these kind of fields. If you just think about all the fields there are PhDs in, those fields used to be part of philosophy. In fact, when we talk about the sciences today, they were called natural philosophy up until, the 19th century, when they started changing the name. So, I mean, a lot of fields, psychology is one of the newer examples of a brand new field that's just sort of generating out of philosophy and so on. But we're all philosophers. I mean, just asking questions and trying to understand what's going on in the world makes us all philosophers. And philosophy as a study studies that, as Donna Charon, the philosopher who's here when I came to Lindenwood 17 years ago, said, philosophy is reason in the world. And reason has two primary functions, a theoretical function and a practical function. And philosophy has both theoretical and practical aspects and covers any kind of thought that's thought out.
All right, excellent. So using that as a springboard, we'll kind of dive in here, and I'd like for each of you, in no particular order, to tell the students about your experience being both a university philosophy professor and a card-carrying, professing Christian. And if you don't mind, include in your answer something about the sort of philosophical issues that you actually focus on in your own research. And if you need me to repeat the question, I can.
Here's what I propose. Start with Michael, and that way, then the next time we'll start with Rachel, and then the next time we'll start with Joseph. Go, Michael.
Okay.
Then I'll go last. Yeah. Then the next time, right?
Okay, Dad.
That'll be good.
Well, I just very briefly, I'll say, I grew up under a very rigid kind of Christianity. That was the kind of home I was in. It was a very, if I may say so, kind of simple-minded, very straightforward, fundamentalist Christianity. Thinking was discouraged, and that sort of thing, which wasn't good for me because I couldn't help it. I laid awake at night and thought all the time, and drove my teachers crazy and that kind of thing. But I towed the fundamentalist line for my parents, and unfortunately, that did not stand up to the test of college. I really was one of those people who got into college, started asking even more intense, big, existential type questions. What's the meaning of it all that kind of thing. In my case, I eventually found my way into a philosophy of literature class where I had to read one of the most famous novels of all time by Fyodor Dostoevsky, a 19th century Russian novelist, called The Brothers Karamazov, where the problem of suffering is really laid out in some really startling ways and very sharp ways. And it really grabbed me. And in fact, in the same week, in another class, I had to read Mark Twain's famous novel, The Mysterious Stranger, which is kind of his presentation of the problem of suffering. And it was kind of a 1-2 punch for me. And I started out that week as a Christian, and I ended that week as an agnostic, really, not knowing what to think, and kind of angry, and I was really gripped by this problem, couldn't find any answers. And so I think, it was inevitable, just for the sake of time here, that I would eventually go on and get a Ph.D. in philosophy and do my dissertation on this problem, the problem of suffering. And where I feel like the problem is often not laid out very well. It's a problem that is often laid out too abstractly, and that's something that I criticize in my dissertation. And so I kind of wrote my dissertation in order actually to, with kind of an audience in mind, I actually want them to help them come to grips with the problem. And because I think most of us, when we are suffering and we start asking those questions, why this, why that, why me, why her, why him, we read stories in the paper, what have you, that really startle us, right? The abstract problem doesn't really help. The abstract problem, as it's normally laid out, is this, though, just so you know what I'm talking about. It deals with the following 3 propositions. God is all good. I bet that's something you all agree with, right? As Christians. God is all-powerful. Another proposition we all agree with, right? And the third one is the proposition, yet evil exists, right? And I think a lot of us would agree that evil is fairly real, right? And it does exist. It's something we need to deal with, right? And but here's the problem. Can we hold all 3 of those propositions together, okay, at the same time and believe all of them equally? A lot of people who present the problem want to sacrifice one of those propositions, okay? Either they say, well, God maybe is not all good, or God is not all powerful, or maybe God doesn't exist at all, or maybe evil is just an illusion or something like that. And I think none of us really here generally want to buy into any of those kinds of moves. So how do we make sense, though, of all 3 of these propositions? Well, what I've kind of come to see, though, I think, one reason why I think the answers that are given to this problem, answers like, well, God has a greater good in mind, or whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger, suffering makes us stronger. Those answers are pretty good for some kinds of suffering, right? and the kinds of suffering that perhaps we're normally used to, losing a job, you know, maybe the end of a friendship or of a relationship, something like that. But Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov confronts us with something far more startling. He tells a series of stories that scholars have found out were actually true. He was using stories that he had located in Russian newspapers. What do we do with a story like this, where a little 5-year-old girl wets her bed, her parents beat her, scream at her, take her into the outhouse? This is the 19th century, right? And pardon some of the startling language I'm going to use here, okay? But I want to really press this problem, okay? They take her out there, beat her some more. They take the excrement from the outhouse, smear it all over her, make her eat some of it, and leave her there to die in the elements. Okay, I think we have a different problem now, don't we? The proposition evil exists is not some abstract sort of thing anymore, right? And our normal moves that we make, there's a greater plan, or, you know, suffering can make us stronger. They obviously don't work here, do they, right? And so I really got into this more concrete version of the problem of evil, and that's what I've been working on a lot in my reflections and my classrooms and that sort of thing. I've taught a seminar on the problem of suffering a few times now, and but that's what my dissertation tries to respond to as a philosophical issue, right? Because I think we as Christians, we need to move away from easygoing, convenient cliches, right? That kind of cover up problems, don't really respond to them or answer them. If we are going to be effective witnesses with the people we meet on the street, right? Someone could very well ask you, right? Okay, you've got this response to the problem that evil exists, but what, you know, this happened to me, or this happened to a friend of mine, et cetera, right? Something that may be a lot more serious. So anyway, I don't know how much time I've taken up here, but I will just say this, that that's kind of that's a very important part of my research and my own life's journey, and it's an important part of my classroom, and I try and connect it with other ideas too that maybe we can get into later on. But one that I would like to pick just from Plato's Republic that I think connects very interestingly with this problem of suffering, and that I always teach when I teach Introduction to Philosophy. And that is, Plato confronts us with a very interesting question, a very poignant kind of existential question in the Republic. And by the way, if you've never read the Republic, it is one of a handful of just essential reads in philosophy, okay? It really is a book you need to read someday. But Plato at one point asks the question, if you had to choose between the doing of injustice and the suffering of injustice, if those really are your choices, which would you do? Which would you do? And my students are always really startled by this question. They're like, oh, well, I think I know what I ought to do, but I also got to know what I probably would do, right? No one wants to suffer, right? And so what a really interesting question, though, to grapple with, right? A very practical question, because that kind of thing, I think, confronts us more often than we realize in our lives, right? In our daily lives. Are we going to do injustice, or are we going to take the hit and suffer, right? And do what Christ himself did, right? And so that's a really important idea to grapple with that connects with the problem of suffering.
That's a good idea. That's a good place to wrap, too.
Okay. I'm sorry I lost some track of time.
No, that's all right. That's all right. So again, well, yeah, sure. In 3 or 4 minutes or less, go ahead and tell us about your experience being both a university philosophy professor and a Christian, and include in your answer, something about the kind of issues that you are focusing on in your research.
Sure. So I was really struck right around your age, actually, with with some facts that I hadn't previously been aware of, which is that in the 20th century, under communist regimes, 4 times as many people were killed by their own governments as died in the wars, and they were the worst wars that the earth had ever seen. So that was particularly shocking to me, and so that inspired my interest in political philosophy and trying to understand the way that society ought to be organized, since obviously some ways are pretty bad. And of course, there are certain philosophical assumptions that underlie the way that we organize society. And, for instance, communists are overtly atheist. They reject a traditional view of human nature, et cetera, right? And so we can think about the connection between the metaphysical questions and the political questions. So as a Christian, I had a special interest in those things. And then, of course, Christians, I think, also naturally, if we're thoughtful about our faith, think a lot about power. Jesus is king of the whole universe, and he died on a cross. And he did not impose his kingdom violently, and is in fact very slowly persuading, making his case, right, over the course of thousands of years to usher in his kingdom. That's a fascinating way to be a king, isn't it? It makes one think about the nature of power. And so I became focused on that. And I would say, in a practical sense, as a Christian, my faith has very seriously influenced my research and my work, because now I run a think tank called the Liberty and Ethics Center, and I do all sorts of work, but I know one way that it all connects, and that is that some of the insights that we come across in political philosophy, and the particular one I'm thinking of is something called emergent order, which is just the idea that you have certain fundamental institutions that create like an infrastructure for a society, and then out of those institutions bubbles up very complex, not institutions, but very complex systems, like a market economy, right? Or language is another example, or money. Those are all things that sort of occur spontaneously out of these institutions. And so if we as Christians are concerned about, for instance, the poor, right, which we ought to be, then how do we address the needs of the poor? Do we focus on policies, for instance, that jump into the middle of the emergent order and try to tweak little pieces of it? Well, that might cause unintended consequences, right? So instead, perhaps we should focus on the institutions themselves. I mean, you see this in the Hebrew scriptures with rules about property and justice and so forth. And bringing people into the institutions, making sure that they have access to the institutions in order to allow them to flourish, have a flourishing life that is not one of dependence, but one that encourages their dignity and their personhood. And that's really a value that I brought from my faith to the work that I do with my center.
So I work primarily with old philosophical texts, medieval philosophical texts. And that has sort of a hidden agenda behind it. The medieval texts that would have existed anywhere from 250 AD to about roughly 1450 AD. That was a time when philosophy and Christianity would have been quite harmonized. You would have found a lot of similarities there. Philosophy would have been used as the handmaiden to theology and Christian reflection. And so by doing that historical work, I kind of get an edge because I can work on Christian and philosophy texts under the guise of being kind of historian. However, I'm also incredibly interested in how well those arguments from the Middle Ages compete with contemporary and modern philosophical positions. And in the last, 15 to 20 years, there's been a revival of the philosophy of Aristotle, a classical philosopher from Greece. And his philosophy dominated the Middle Ages. So by having that sort of revival happen today with contemporary philosophy, it's allowed me to look at medieval Christian texts, use the arguments that were there, and put them in a contemporary vein. So it's quite exciting research. I think that's all I have.
Part of the question was philosophy in the university, right, in general. And I think across the board we see philosophy, among other branches of humanities, under assault in most universities in favor of either programs like, business or, practical kinds of job-getting programs or STEM programs. Everyone's, supposed to do that kind of thing. And what's truly human seems to be sort of being sucked out of the university. And philosophy has always been one of the main bulwarks against that. And as Christians, we have certain beliefs about human nature. We have certain kinds of commitments. And we have to be able to defend those. We have to be able to argue about those or at least discuss those. And part of the suppression of the humanities, in particular philosophy, is that you can't have certain debates on campus anymore. You get shut down, shouted out. You're not allowed to discuss, to reason, to ask questions, to have doubts, to explore anymore because you have to toe the line with a certain kind of orthodoxy, And it's a militant, secularist kind of orthodoxy that's being imposed on us. And insofar as philosophy and humanities are, getting marginalized, that kind of thing is getting excluded, and it's been harmful to education. In my own particular work, I focused on Cicero's De Officiis, which I found St. Ambrose, who is Augustine's mentor, used that book for the first systematic work on Christian ethics ever. He used Cicero for the foundation of Christian ethics, the first systematic work. And I also found out that David Hume, the most anti-Christian ethicist, explicitly anti-Christian ethicist, used the same book. That got me curious, right? And historically, this book had been used by Christians, non-Christians, anti-Christians, everybody across the board used this book. All the major moral theories, modern moral theories, whether they're, Kant or Mill or whatever, can be traced back to having influences from this particular book. So it's an important work, not just in the history of ethics, but in sort of bridging the gap between Christian ethics and sort of secular ethics. In fact, C.S. Lewis said Christianity cannot be the promulgation of a new form of ethics, right? That Christianity itself depends upon an ethic that already exists that's in the world. And you can see that, in Genesis and Paul's discussion on Mars Hill in Romans chapter 1 and 2. You can see those kind of things. So my work has been trying to just defend ethics in a world that's more increasingly skeptical as a way of at least keeping the door open, right? If we can, we can agree that these practical ethics laid down in Cicero make sense given that human nature is a certain way, we can agree on that, and then we can talk about the backstory, right? What makes the best sense of our natural curiosity, of our social nature, of these kinds of things? Is it more sensible to think of this as part of God's plan and ordering in the world, which I think it obviously is, or can we account for this just as random chance or, something like that? So that's been primarily my work, to try to defend philosophy and the humanities against this kind of secularist onslaught.
That's excellent. It's a nice side door, too, that you can enter into and to talk about, important issues. Dr. Beabout.
Yeah, I would just say a few things. I work in a department with about 20 philosophers. Right, so you could have a joke right there, right? You put 20 philosophers in a room, and you probably have about 50 different opinions on any topic. It's a diverse group of people. Some of my colleagues, I don't know, a quarter of them for sure of the 20 would not self-identify as Christian, right? Some are Jewish, some are agnostic, some are atheists. And of those who are Christians, so the majority would self-identify as Christian, there's a range of different kinds of Christians. There's Orthodox, right, different kinds of Protestants and Roman Catholics. So I guess I've been in that role now almost 30 years. So partly my role means living with people who think a lot, and some who think about things in ways that are really different from mine, and some who think about things in ways that, I have really spirited and helpful conversations with them. So, for me, being both someone who understands, I understand myself to be a Christian, or someone trying to be a better Christian, and as someone who thinks of myself as a philosopher, it means being in a community of people who think of themselves as seeking wisdom and pursuing the truth, sometimes in ways that are antagonistic to my Christian faith, and sometimes with other people who think about the Christian faith in ways that are rather different than the way I do. So,
Just riffing on that, we hear, I think, in our circles an awful lot about how frustrating, maybe even dangerous it is to encounter ideas that are contrary to our own. I'd like for you to maybe talk about the flip side of that briefly, and just say to the students how that's actually helped you in your relationship with Jesus and in your relationship with non-Christians.
So part of what I've learned as a philosopher is that things that I thought I understood, I come to see, because Dr. Duchamp, you said earlier, right, you might ask someone, well, why do you do that, right? Well, because it's holy. Or why do you do that? Because it's just. And then they start asking you, well, what is justice? And you're like, well, it's justice. Or what is holiness? Well, come on, we all know what that is. And then it turns out I'm not very good at explaining something that I thought I understood. And so sometimes being challenged can be helpful. Sometimes it's not helpful. So there's a part of philosophy, it seems to me, that can, at some times in our lives, be unhelpful and destructive. But there's a way in which, if we're going to really see ourselves as journeying towards the truth, we have to make ourselves vulnerable to those who are going to challenge us. Yeah.
Well said. So students, we had a few other questions here, but honestly, I want to hear from you guys, and I know the panelists would like to hear from you guys. So in terms of just the format here, raise your hand. I'll call on you. You'll, as best you can, ask your question, and then if you guys don't mind, just repeat the question back. And by the way, mention if it's for a specific panelist, or if it's just for the whole group, or for anybody that cares to answer it. So, all right, I think that, who was the first? Yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
This one is for Dr. Carper.
Great.
So I was wondering, do you think, you said that you thought some explanations for the origin of sin and the problem of evil are not sufficient. Do you think that the hypothesis that it isn't really our question to ask God why there's all this sin and suffering in the world, because he's the one who's trying to clean it up, he's the one who sent his son to die for us, and that would be equivalent to telling the one trash collector in the city that he's not doing a good job because he hasn't gotten to our part yet, even though he's working his heart out? Do you think that that is a good argument for against the problem of evil? Do you think that one stands up?
Well, I'm going to refer to someone in the Bible. Job would not, right? Does that answer the question? Yeah. Job questioned God, didn't he? And in fact, I still find it fascinating that this book is in the Bible, right? That here we have a person who, starts off, we're told he's this really righteous person, right? He's done nothing to deserve what happens to him, yet all these terrible things happen, and he questions God quite vocally and passionately, wouldn't you say, right? And so, and he, in a certain sense, he wins what he wants, right? Because God reveals himself to him in a very unique way, right? So Job gets what he wants in the long run, and he wouldn't have gotten it had he not questioned. So,
David does too. Psalm 73.
yeah, that's a good answer too.
Yes, sir. What's your question? Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, you were first. I missed you. You first, please.
Okay. So I have a question for the whole panel. So you referred earlier to how God is all-powerful, and I was thinking, if God is all powerful, could there be a way that he could limit his own power?
Okay, so before you answer that, so tomorrow we actually are going to have 3 different lectures on the problem of evil and suffering, problem of pain, etc. And it's all right for you guys to answer that. That's fine, but this isn't Stump the Philosopher. How many angels can fit on the head of a needle? Kind of. That's not what we're here for. Did Adam have nipple or a belly button? That's not why we're here. You've heard. It is a fun question. If one of you though would like to, just offer a quick, maybe even witty response to that question, Michael, let's do it. Yeah.
I'll keep it in one sentence. That may be what free will is. God limiting himself.
I'll try for wit, but somebody asked to see God as he was, and God said, if you see my face, you'll die, but you can look at my backside.
All right, so this question back here.
This is for whoever. Just wondering, what authority does philosophy have, and what can philosophy establish?
That's a very good question. Yeah.
Yes. So this is a great question that medieval philosophers struggled with. If we think about all the possible logical relationships between faith and reason, we should probably say something about the definitions of those words, right? Faith would have, I'd say, have a wide meaning where I'm going to include all of these various dimensions of faith. Volition, or having to do with the will, something that people willingly do. It certainly has something to do with the intellect, because we believe propositions with faith. And I think there's also an affective emotional level where we feel something when we believe with faith. And then on the other side, with reason, I would just limit it to say things that we can arrive at through reason or experience, as Dr. Beabout said. So think about all the relationships you can get between those, right? There's some philosophers might say, look, everything that's available to faith is available to reason, right? So anything that a Christian believes, they should be able to argue for from the ground up without revelation. Now, very few philosophers held that in the Middle Ages. A more prominent view that's taken off in the modern age is to say everything that's available to reason is also available to faith, but not everything that's available to faith is available to reason. So that'd be like the rationalist position, right? A strong sort of scientific kind of view. And then I think a faith-based approach, what we might call fideism, would say something like, there are things that aren't available to reason, so it can't get us what we want if we really want to achieve full Christian, a fully Christian life. But I think the best logical relationship between them is to say there are some propositions that we believe by faith, some that we believe by reason, and some that fit in both. So if you want to know what some things are that philosophy can establish, in my classes I argue that the proofs for God's existence work. Now we have to do a lot of legwork there to sort of clear out all the muck that came up in the modern age of philosophy. But we can establish certain things I think are like what we might call preambles to faith. So I'm still on the fence about it, but it certainly seems to me we might be able to establish that the soul can exist after death. I know the other philosophers around me are gritting their teeth because this is not a very normal contemporary position. But those seem to be two really important commitments for many Christians, that you can at least prove that there is a God, and then you can choose to put your trust in him, that he'll, right, work your life out in the way that it's supposed to be worked out, that you can obey his will. And the idea, right, that there's an afterlife, or that the soul persists, that there's maybe a judgment, right, those sorts of things can be part of, I think, philosophical reflection as well. Does that answer your question? Like in terms of two options that we might have on the table? Yeah?
David, you had a question that you'd like to ask? What is that?
Yes. So, in regards to the problem of evil, because that's one of those big hot button issues, and there's been something that I've seen in the way that Americans perceive this, which I've never quite fully understood, and that's that. What triggered this was I heard communism brought up earlier, and under communism we've had over 50 million deaths, yet under Nazism we only had 6 million. So how come communism can seem as worse as Nazism, since we as humans generally tend to see
Well, it's actually 12, just under 12 million with Hitler.
But it's also higher for communism.
Yeah.
Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, what was the question?
Well, it's a really interesting question, right? Why do we always say, Hitler would have done that, right? When we're on the internet, it's always Hitler, he's Satan. But why don't we say Stalin or Mao? We don't. Yeah, I mean, the numbers are astounding, absolutely astounding. It's a fascinating question. I mean, I think I'd have to think about it. But, part of it could just be that they're over there, they're a little further away. That could be part of it. But there was a lot of apology for the communist regimes going on in American journalism and among the American intelligentsia throughout the early 20th century. And so now, I mean, if we were going to be really honest about it in academia, we'd really have to repent of some things that occurred and earlier. And so I don't know if part of it is pride and unwillingness to do that. And part of it may be a fascination with the idea. And I'll just say one quick thing here, which is the idea of central planning is very attractive. I centrally plan my household. If I run a business, I centrally plan that. I centrally plan my classroom. And it's very counterintuitive to say to people, well, when a system gets really big and complex, you can't centrally plan it, but it can still work really well. It's just hard to wrap your brain around that. How do prices work? How do you decide how much to charge for bread? Wouldn't it be more efficient if we just decided that, and made it scientific? And so it's part of this scientism, this idea that if the rational, calculative mind, it's an enlightenment or a post-enlightenment kind of view, right? That if the calculative mind is planning it, it will be better than whatever nature or nature establishes. And so it's a truth that you have to constantly go back to and sort of remind yourself of because it's so counterintuitive. But we believe a lot of things that are counterintuitive. I mean, scientists have told us that this table is actually full of things that are slightly in motion, which seems weird, right? But nobody denies that, and we know that the sun is in the center of the galaxy and we go around it. I mean, that doesn't look right. It looks like the sun's going around us. But so we're capable of grasping counterintuitive truths, but they're very, very hard to keep in our minds when we're thinking about the actual practical questions.
Yeah, that's helpful. You had a question.
Yeah. So this is not necessarily a philosophical question, sorry. But Rachel, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about why we don't see many women teaching higher education philosophy and theology, but more specifically teaching higher education philosophy.
What a great question. So philosophy is actually one of the lowest contingencies of women. I think it's 16%. And there's a lot of debate about why. I would be happy to get others' input as well, but I can throw out a couple of things they're thoughts that I've had. Boy, they're so politically incorrect, I almost feel nervous to say them. But it's a sanctuary.
It's not like we're recording it.
Yeah.
If you're afraid it'll jeopardize your career, we can edit it out of the video.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly women often choose to do jobs that are conducive to family life. Okay, and so that's a part of it because, for instance, think of the tenure system, right? Where if you become a professor, you get hired, you've got to publish all this stuff and get tenure. That's going to happen right around your 30s when you get out of grad school, which is right when you want to have babies. Okay, so there's a lot of women who might start but not finish, and some of that is very practical. I also wonder sometimes if something about our biology affects it in that women are, by our nature, kind of anchored down to the practical realm, right, in some sense. I mean, we can't escape it if we're going to have a family and so forth. And remember, all these medieval men were all in monasteries. I mean, they weren't fathers. They weren't family men. They were monks. Well, they were spiritual fathers. But, but they they had the opportunity to really launch into the abstract. And that was even true for the Greeks, who were wealthy men, right? And other people ran their estates and things like that. So when it just comes to kind of a sifting process between who's able to really pursue this and who's not, that can be part of it. And even the interests. I mean, I've noticed that women, not always, but often women do tend to choose the more practical questions in philosophy, like political philosophy. And you don't see as many women in epistemology as you see men. And I just wonder sometimes if it's not because we want to see kind of where the rubber meets the road. You know, there's that kind of practical anchoredness. But that's just my made up theory. I mean, I have nothing to base that on except, you know, that it makes sense to me. So does anybody else want to comment on the agenda? No, no.
I want to. No, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. And my entire experience in philosophy has never felt any kind of inferiority of women. And that's because as a BA at Kansas, my two main philosophical mentors were both women, Teresa Robertson and Sarah Sawyer. And I swear they still exist in the back of my head. Everything I've done since that moment on is always them challenging me harder because they were taskmasters. So I don't have in my mind that kind of view, but I'm sure the statistics probably look different. I imagine if I go to conferences and look around, I'm probably going to see minorities of women, but not in terms of intellectual prowess. And many of the women philosophers I read in my own research are profound.
That's who I would like just to mention real quick, because I'm putting together a course myself that I'm teaching in the spring for the first time, Women in Philosophy. And it's not a feminist philosophy class, but it's a collection of readings from well-established female philosophers. And if you want that list, if anyone wants that list, just come talk to me. There are some amazing female philosophers, amazing writers and thinkers. I just wanted to let you know that. If you want those names, let me know.
Well, and just along the same lines as Joseph here, you know, one of the most stellar female philosophers in the world is here at St. Louis University, Eleanor Stomp at St. Louis University, and she's a Christian, very dedicated Christian philosopher, very important, and she absolutely inspired me. So yeah, same point.
Her book on the problem of suffering, Wandering in Darkness, helped reconvert me, just to say that real quick. Wow. It's that good a book.
But she also does obscure metaphysics. So she does the, you know, the abstract stuff.
All right, so on that, we're going to take a 5-minute breather to allow for the students to use restrooms, stretch their legs, and then we'll come back for more Q&A. Find your seat. What's the next step? Be quiet. Yes, that's right. Be quiet. Yeah, that's right. You know, that's actually the third step. Find your seat, sit in it, and then quiet down. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump right back into Q&A. And if you just want to raise your hand with the next question, we'll call on you. You can ask your question, and then we'll go from there. I know you had your hand up. Yes, ma'am. What's your question? And speak up a little if you could. So let's solve the problem of autonomy, free will, sovereignty, predestination, in a 5-minute answer.
Well, so there's a famous response by the medieval philosopher Boethius, and there's an image you can have, kind of like picture a mountain, and God is at the top of the mountain, and then there's a door at the bottom of the mountain, you know, with like a road in front of it or something. And so things are whizzing past the door, and we're standing in the doorway, and we see the moments like this, right? But God is at the top of the mountain watching it all happen. But that's an attribute of his. It's not an action. He's not making those things happen just because he's seeing them happen. Is that an okay way of saying it?
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, without getting into debates on soteriology, I mean, so there are perspectives on this from the Catholic camp, Lutheran camp, Presbyterian camp, Wesleyan camp, no. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to answer it, but you guys can talk about your opinions on the matter freely. That's what we're here to do. Freely.
I would say, I mean, maybe here's an insight we can get by just thinking of the word free, right? So it comes from old Germanic language. The day of the week, Friday, right? So we say free day, but it's named after an old Germanic goddess. In the Romance languages, right, it's named after Venus. And so she's the equivalent of Venus. She's the wife of Odin. Wednesday is named after Odin, right? Now, Odin held slaves, right? And the slaves stayed there because if they ran away, Odin was going after them, and he didn't want that, right? But she stayed with him, right? Not because she was afraid, right? But out of love. And so free has this element of love and devotion. Think of all our words that are like that. A friend, right, is, there's an aspect of you want to be with this person. In Danish, the word free, F-R-I, right, is the word used to propose in marriage, right? And so there's one aspect of freedom where we tend, I heard this in the question, it's this notion of freedom from, right? I don't want to be controlled. I want to, right? But there's also, if you think of the freedom that you feel when you're with your friends, right? Or imagine someone offering you their hand in marriage. Think of that as free, right? It's not just that you're free from, but you're free to, right? But that also gives rise to the question, what is that freedom to act for? What's the good that you're going to be pursuing? So freedom has these at least three elements. That there's the freedom from part. Philosophers sometimes call that negative freedom, right? There's the freedom to part, the freedom to act. Philosophers sometimes call that positive freedom. And then there's the freedom for part. And philosophers sometimes call that moral freedom. And I think that kind of distinction helps, it at least makes the question more complicated.
Yeah, I always like to ask students, and what I'll just ask you, what is the typical American definition of freedom? Being able to do what you want, to do what you desire. I was talking with one of you at lunch about this very thing earlier today, right? Well, what is, in this context, a Christian context, that definition sounds awfully close to the definition for something else we're quite familiar with. What is it? Sin, right? Absolutely, right? And so it's interesting, though, when Americans tend to think about freedom, we tend to see it merely in terms of choice, being able to do what I desire, etc. Whereas, and I think I'm squaring with everything else that's been said here, for centuries in the Greek world, certainly in the medieval world, even some of the moderns, freedom is defined as the increasing capacity to do the good, right? And that's true freedom. So, yeah.
Well,
Do what we ought to do.
What we ought to do as opposed to what we want to do.
So you can square that with the doing what I want to do, actually, if you use the smoking example, right? So if I'm a smoker, which I was as a teenager, and so let's say I want to quit smoking. So I think to myself, oh man, I really want a cigarette, So if I choose to smoke, I'll feel good because I relieved the stress, but I'll feel bad because I didn't quit because I know I'm killing myself. But if I choose not to smoke, I'll feel great because I'm sticking to my thing, but I'll feel bad because I'm super stressed out. So I can't do what I want to do because I want two things that oppose one another. which is why Kierkegaard said purity of heart is to will one thing. Or maybe. If you agree with that.
No, it's interesting.
Do you guys want to say anything?
Well, and I think that this question comes up a lot, and it is partly theological, it's partly philosophical, right? There's overlap a great deal. Do you guys agree that the term free will is rather loaded? I mean, what do you mean by free will? That's, I think, a helpful question. And so maybe we could just ask that. What do you guys think free will actually is in the Christian worldview, under the umbrella of Christian? And I don't necessarily want to get into debates on total depravity and whatnot, but do you agree that that's a loaded term? I mean, who among us is free from the effects of the fall? Would you guys like to speak to that a little bit? And I like that there are different traditions up here represented too, because I think that'd be interesting.
I'll just try and go fast. I spent a long time this afternoon talking to them about my recent book, but I didn't talk about one of my first books is called Freedom and Its Misuses. And in chapter 7 of that book, I lay out 4 different accounts of freedom, and so I untangle it that way. I won't go through it all here, but I think that's part of what philosophers do, is they engage in sort of subtle drawing of distinctions, that we can think about it this way and think about it this way. And sometimes when it looks like there's a contradiction, it's because we're using a term in multiple different ways, and a thing could be true in this sense, but not true in that sense. And if we see, well, we're thinking about it in more than one way, and we can untangle that. I think that's one way that philosophy can be helpful.
I actually just want to make a cultural comment, if I could. A class I teach is philosophy of technology, and technology today is always marketed as, here, get this, and you will experience no limits, right? The unlimited capacity to do something, right? No limits, no limits, no limits. And the culture pushes that idea, in fact, all the time, right? I know a colleague, in fact, who is always arguing that science has no limits. I'll come back to that later maybe, but I won't go into that right now. But my point is that we live in a culture today where, and I hope you understand this reference, one of the principal cave shadows that we buy into is that technology will free us, right? That technology and science and all of that, right, is what gives us greater freedom. Well, once again, what does technology mainly today enable us to do? To gratify our desires, right, in a more convenient manner. And I just wanted to throw that observation and reflection out, given how just omnipresent technology is today in our lives, how it's marketed, and how I think it's very contrary to the things that deep down we believe in this room. Does that make sense? Okay, just wanted to make that comment.
To change the tone a little bit, I wanted to address this question in terms of spiritual formation. There are really interesting answers to this question, thoughtful, that you can pursue. The one thing that I would encourage you to do, and this is my soapbox, is never, ever compromise on the idea that God is good. Don't pursue a theology that undermines the goodness of God. The goodness of God is the basis of our entire identity and nature. And so it's the most important truth that we need to abide in. Jesus said he abided in the Father, and we should abide in him. And it's the goodness of God that means that he's trustworthy, et cetera. And so the questions around freedom are difficult. I understand that. And I understand the push and pull of those questions. But I would just return to be sort of anchored in that truth.
Unless Dr. Steineger and Dr. Brown have any comments on the free will question, we can move on to another.
Yeah, maybe something that hasn't been said that's part of the classical heritage of philosophy is thinking about the common sense value of responsibility. like the fact that law and promises are all built on a kind of responsibility that we expect people can do what they say they're going to do. So the person I have in mind in the Christian tradition would be a 8th century Christian named John of Damascus. He was one of the first Christians to live after the rise of Islam. He actually lived in Syria. And he says that there are things that depend on us, and God's predestination doesn't extend to those things. It's a quite radical move, because it's in sharp contrast with things that are said in the Western Christian tradition. So maybe one way to think about the free will question is to think about the judgment, which is part of every creed of Christianity. We believe there will be a judgment, and people will be held account for what they did. So that's the same kind of common sense value of responsibility. I think we need something like freedom or free will as a concept to help us understand why that makes sense. Yeah.
So accountability, responsibility, important concepts. All right, so other questions? We have you again, yes, sir?
Yeah. This is for the whole panel. If God loves us, as he says in the Bible, then why would he create a hell?
You didn't realize that there's going to be
No.
Theology 101.
Well, one of the responses is, right, he didn't create hell. Having given us freedom, he's not going to force himself on us. If I choose to reject God, if I choose to reject his love, his grace, that's hell. Doesn't have to be a place. It's respecting the dignity of me as a person to choose. So it's just, you can't have a choice without real consequences.
Yeah, God is love and light and all goodness, and I teach Dante. I teach a class on Dante, and so this idea of just not being with him, right? That means there's no truth. You know, he's the truth. So if you're not with him, you're not with truth. You're not with love. You're not with light. You're in the cold. Sounds bad.
Yeah, Dostoevsky once again defines hell as being in the eternal presence of God's love without the capacity to return or respond to that love. And so I think that dovetails nicely with what Dr. Brown just said. Maybe there is really only heaven, and believers experience heaven as heaven, and unbelievers experience heaven as hell. Does that make some sense? You know? So I don't know, I mean, I'm not trying to be heretical here or not. I know most of us want to imagine it as some kind of separate place or whatever, right? But yeah, I mean, if God respects our choices, I think Dr. Brown is correct.
There's lots of room for speculation, you know. I mean, we were just talking about Imagineering. Incidentally, we're not trying to build new doctrines here, but we're trying to think of creative ways to answer a really difficult
To make sense of the doctrines.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Other questions?
Right here.
Where is it at?
She's had her hand up for a while.
My goodness, I'm so sorry. Yes, please.
I'm sorry this isn't a very thought-provoking question, but I was just curious. Philosophy seems like it could get in the way of like your beliefs in Christianity. So I was wondering if anyone on the panel has come into contact with that, and how did you like remain steadfast in your Christianity?
A great question.
Great job.
Yeah.
Very good.
That is such a good question. It's one that was actually given to me in advance so that it could be answered. So, Mr. Steineger,
Yeah.
please.
So I think that's really important as a question, especially for many of you who are thinking about going into college in the next couple years. Our department here at Lindenwood is made up of these 4 people right here. And so you've got a department that's made up of believers. That is so rare, I can't think of another department that has that, right? Yeah. So my whole experience with philosophy departments, wherever I've been an adjunct teacher or a student, has been quite hostile to Christian beliefs on the whole. And I mean that even with mentors that I've had. So I think it's very important to know that when you're thinking about taking a philosophy class in college, not to come in, you know what I mean, under the assumption it's going to look like this panel. It's something that you're going to do, I think, and it depends on what class you take in a philosophy department. I mean, my recommendation is that you look for intro-level classes on critical thinking, and you kind of get really strong in your logic. But if you do anything that's more high order in philosophy, you're kind of learning another secular language sometimes. And so if you're really serious about apologetics, then you take those classes the same way you would take a history of Islam class, right? You're not a Muslim, but you really want to understand what the arguments are. So I would just say, not all philosophy is good philosophy. So, and I know there's a lot of media stuff out there to help remind you of that in the Christian world, but it's a good thing to remember.
And not all philosophy is bad either, obviously. I mean, can I give a quick example of philosophy in action and how it can work for you? I was teaching my Intro to Human Nature class one day, and one of my best students became a major and advisee of mine. He came up after class and said, because we'd been talking about evolution, he said, I'll just say science teacher said the other day in class, she made the following claims, and here they are. There are no limits to science. That's one claim that the teacher made. Only science can give us knowledge. That was another claim. And only matter is real. This was in a science class. Now here's my question to you, and you don't need, and I'm not trying to sound bad here, okay, but I just want to say you don't need to resort to the Bible here or anything to ask the following question. In fact, maybe I'll throw it out. What question needs to be asked here? Are these three claims scientific claims, right? Are they scientific claims? And they're not, are they? What kind of claims are they? They're philosophical, almost metaphysical or epistemological sorts of claims, right? And here's the cinch question. Here's the question to really ask any teacher who makes these kinds of claims in the classroom. Frame for me, Dr. So-and-so, some kind of scientific experiment that either verifies or falsifies these claims. And guess what? You can't do it with these claims, right? That right there is proof positive that what we have here are philosophical assertions, right? That are being added to the scientific material that's being talked about. This is the difference between what is known as scientism, which is a philosophy, right, that's added to certain kinds of scientific ideas, right, versus science itself, right? Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. That's philosophy in action. That's what philosophy can do for you.
Is it fair? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Beabout.
No, good.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, is it fair to say that even a statement like philosophy is awful, you should stay away from it, is a philosophy of sorts? It's a bad philosophy, but it's almost as if we can't get away from philosophy.
I want to respond to the question in a different way as I'm looking at the panel. I mean, one, it's a really impressive panel, but two, my hair is whiter than anyone on the panel, so I get to say this. One, I hope your life is long, and here's part of what you're going to find out: the doubts and questions that you have when you're a teenager. In college, I mean, you're going to have questions there too. They're not exactly the same, but I mean, it's a period where it's really normal to go through doubts and questions and naggings, and I mean, and you can be a person of faith and still think, I want to understand this better. And sometimes going through that, seeking to understand it better, you'll go through stretches where it's like, I'm not even sure what I do believe. Now, for me, I don't think I've missed Sunday church in more than 40 years, right? But that's not to say I haven't gone through stretches where it like seems dry and it seems dark and it's like, and I sometimes feel like, am I just going through the motions now? And that's different when you're in your 30s and when in your 40s. And I've had some, and I mean, you have things where you see things in the world that you just never thought you'd see that. And then you're like, well, how does all this make sense? And philosophy can sometimes do that, but life can sometimes do that, not philosophy. And so, yeah, I guess that's part of my answer. Your question is, how do you hold on to your faith, right, when philosophy is provoking you to ask questions that seem to undermine your faith? And I guess I would turn it around and say, how do you hold on to your faith when life is provoking you in ways that seem to undermine your faith? And I don't know, I don't have much wisdom there, except, right, you're going to go through dry patches, you're going to go through tough stretches, you're going to go through periods where, you know, life is like that. And there's suffering in life, and there's stretches where it's hard. And, but, you know, there's new springtimes every year. Every year of my life, spring has come back. And yeah, so I guess that's part of my response.
Helpful. Caleb, you had a question. You had your hand up for a while.
No, I'm not about to get surgery anyway.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. So this is just for the general panel. How does your view or any general view of philosophy show any sort of optimism or pessimism towards the creation wars and the theories of evolution?
That's a fun one.
Trying to make it fun for yourself.
Dr. Brand, we haven't heard enough from you. Grab that mic.
Well, I always, you know, when I give this example, and you know, I used to teach philosophy of science before someone stole it from me.
Someone has a biology degree.
And but only one of us has the HLC required 18 graduate hours in the field.
And he's also the department chair, so.
Who's going to change the schedule shortly? First, I always give examples about, you know, what science can prove and can't prove and that kind of thing in general, right? And I say, look, let's just say the theory of evolution is, however you understand it, is completely true. Absolutely completely true. There are no gaps. There are no leftover questions. There's absolute perfection in your theory, right? Let's just say you've got that, which of course not even close, right? But let's give you that. Yeah, hypothetically, you've got it, no gaps, no leftover questions, everything, right? Here's my response as a believer. God did it that way. What are you going to do, right? What are you going to do? Because that's always available, right? You know, people try to create life in the laboratory. You know, that was a big thing, right? To show life could spontaneously evolve and stuff like that. But you know what? It is impossible to intelligently design an experiment to show that intelligent design is not part of the picture, right? So there's really no conflict in that. And so in one sense, if the biologists look at the world in a certain kind of a way or something like that, that's fine. Augustine laid down the rule, right? If Scripture is ambiguous and science is really clear, or we understand the world to be a certain way, we interpret Scripture in the light of what we know, you know, absolutely certainly. If Scripture is absolutely certain, right, then we interpret science in that kind of a way. And so in terms of the actual debate, you're dealing with the first three chapters of Genesis, which I'm told by scholars was written in Hebrew poetry. And one thing everybody knows is poetry is not, you know, read like a scientific manual, right? So what conflict could there possibly be if you could always say, whatever it is you say, God created the world to work that way, or God created the world to evolve that way, or develop that way? There's no real conflict.
And we spent the better part of yesterday talking about various points of view: young Earth creation, old Earth creation, intelligent design, theistic evolution. So we don't really. I don't think that's a horse that we've kicked, I think, quite a few times. You can, but I was hoping that maybe we could talk more about scientism as a philosophy that seems to be really prevalent in American culture. But please.
There's a Jewish physicist who wrote a book called Genesis and the Big Bang, who argued that the world could literally have been created in 7 literal 24-hour days and at the same time be 15 billion years old. How? Use Einstein's equation. If the universe is receding from God approximately the speed of light, the time apparent to God would be 7 24-hour days, and to us, and us would be 15 billion years. Physics.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to, so Here's a claim you see a lot with reference to natural selection, right? That mutations that happen in biological organisms are random. Here's another example, along with those 3 examples I gave just a few minutes ago, right? Where philosophy has smuggled into science, right? How do you know for certain that they are random mutations? There's a famous evolutionist named Ernst Mayr. M-A-Y-R is his name. He's a very highly regarded figure who has chided evolutionists themselves for smuggling in terms like that. He's saying we can't possibly know that. So there's an example. Does that example make some sense there? Okay.
Yeah, so part of the criticism of scientism, right, is that it's bad science, right? And we've heard this, right, where you have people who claim to be scientists who make claims that are not really scientific claims, right? But there's another kind of claim creeping around here that I want to push on a little bit. Now, I'm not a theologian, although I do have a degree in theology, right? My Ph.D. is in philosophy, but I do have a degree in theology, actually. Look at the biblical story of creation. What day was the sun created? The 4th day. That's right. So tell me about those first 3 days. How long were they? See, when we say a day, we'll say it's 24 hours. But what's 24 hours? We measure 24 hours in terms of the sun, right? So whatever is going on there, right, I don't know if that's a philosophical question or a question of how do you interpret the text. What does day mean there, right? So sometimes the question is this bad science? There's plenty of scientists that are prone to bad science, right? But sometimes Christians have to ask themselves, are we doing bad reading, right? Do we not notice, right, that this term, right, I take Dr. Brown's point about it's a piece of Hebrew poetry where the word day means something different than what we might literally think it to mean.
And those are issues that we covered yesterday, and thanks for speaking to it. I mean, it's a valid point. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah. A lot of the questions asked in philosophy, like, why are we here? What is the meaning of life? They seem to lead down a road that could end in a very anxious or empty state. So where can we find answers of hope in philosophy?
You read my latest book. No.
Read my dissertation?
So are there certain branches of philosophy perhaps that answer questions in more hopeful ways? Is that another way to ask that?
Yeah, so I guess I would answer like that. I mean, there have been a number of references here already to Aristotle, and he takes up exactly these questions that you've said. But let me just try and summarize his methodology really quickly, right? So his strategy usually is to try to understand something, let's look at this thing's activity, right? So if you ask, what's the meaning of life, right? We might think of it like this, well, like, where did life come from, or where are we going, or something? But he, I think, encourages us to ask, what are we doing, right? And you see that in our doing, even look at what we're doing here, right? We're engaging in meaningful activity, right? So that purpose is just like built into what we're doing. And so philosophy can help reveal that to us. And that actually strikes me as both profoundly energizing and profoundly hopeful. That once you start thinking about it that way, in some ways it's tied into what Professor Duchamp said earlier, right? That, it gives birth to a truth that was already within us. I do see that. And that, so I think hope is actually a profound part of I don't know, all the philosophers that I like, it ends up being, it's there in Plato, it's there in Aristotle, it's there in so many of the medieval writers that have been mentioned, and yeah, so I don't know, that's maybe, I could give a long list. I don't have a concrete.
Yeah, most of the sense of hopelessness that's associated with philosophy is just from the last couple of centuries. The vast majority of philosophy is actually quite hopeful, I would say.
I want to talk about sort of a negative aspect, right? Philosophy can also clear away obstacles, like what's the cause of your despair? You know, it could be based on, if the material world is all that there is, then, whatever. Well, you can argue and understand, well, it's not, or we don't know that, we can't say that. So then the reasons for your despair go away. Socrates did this thing about death, right? Why do we fear death if we don't know what it is? And so just thinking about it in that terms takes away some of the fear. And so philosophy can also do, the negative thing of clearing, obstacles away.
So we don't, please.
I was just going to add to all of those. An early Christian thinker, 2nd century, named Justin the Philosopher, Justin Martyr, early Christians really thought of God as having revealed himself in other cultures besides just to the Hebrews. And so for many early Christians, they would have looked at Greek philosophy as being God showing himself, not albeit in a more opaque way than he would have in direct revelation through the Hebrews. So I think that tells us something, right? That there's a sort of seed of optimism there, especially with Aristotle and the classical philosophers in the Hellenistic period as well. Lots of things there that the Christian tradition shared from. And so I think that's a great way to use philosophy. Start at a natural level, right? It's a great apologetic introduction. And then see what you discover. And again, you can find a lot of optimism there that can at least get the concept of God off the ground, I think.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we don't have time for any more questions, but my hope is that if you folks have any closing thoughts, maybe something that a pebble in the shoe maybe that you can leave with the students, that'd be helpful. And no, you're not all obligated to answer, but I'd love it if you did.
Well, I have something I'd like to say.
Hey, now we're not kidding. No respect, please.
Here's my pebble. I'm not exactly sure. It didn't fit perfectly in the last question, but I wanted to say it. So thank you for the pebble in the shoe. Something that's encouraging is the evolution of our moral talk with one another. Let's think of the pagan world prior to Jesus, and the Hebrews would be the only exception. It would have been completely acceptable to throw away, for instance, your baby, a baby that had been born, and put it out into the forest, or attitudes towards women and things like that. And what we see with Jesus, and specifically the generation of people who frankly sacrificed their lives to live according to his way, rescuing sick pagans out of the street and dragging these babies that had been put into the forest into their house and raising them and all sorts of things, right? That early church generation. We see that the entire moral conversation was changed. And so it may be that in many secular conversations about morality, people are riding on what I like to call gospel capital. I got that line from my dad. Because they're saying, oh, well, Immanuel Kant, I got it from somebody else, right? But come on, I mean, the idea of personhood and the value and dignity of the human person is uniquely a Christian idea. The pagan world didn't care about poor people that you aren't related to. It didn't matter because it didn't even occur to them that it should matter, right? Now we think, how can we be leaving someone behind? This is awful, right? And that's the effect of Jesus on the philosophical conversation about morality. That's very hopeful in my mind.
Anyone else with some closing thoughts?
I just wanted to remind everybody, we're going to be setting up a table on Friday when you're all bagging up and leaving. And we'll have a lot of information on our table, both about our department here at Lindenwood, but also about philosophy in general. Our chair was kind enough to put together a nice list of great philosophy books for Christians. It's a whole 2-page list, right, in every subfield of philosophy, general philosophy. We're not going to be able to set it up today, but I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. We'll probably also be doing like a little logic exercise on Friday as you guys are leaving. So I've got some simple exercises just to kind of test what you know about logic, get a better idea of what we do in philosophy. So keep us in mind to maybe stop by and talk with us more then. I think we're also going to be around now for a while for if people want to continue talking to us, correct?
For a little while, yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break, and then Matt's going to lead us in a few worship songs. You're welcome to stick around for that. We'd love it if you did. And then after that, yeah, we've got a lot of free time. So yeah, we'd love for you to stick around if you're able. Yeah. Any other closing thoughts?
Don't forget the love commandment in Scripture, right? Love your God how? Mind is in there too, right? There's a great book on this written by a Christian philosopher named J.P. Moreland called Love Your God with All Your Mind. So that's the pitch we're really making here tonight.
Yeah, I guess I would leave you guys with this challenge. I think of my own life and the way I've seen culture shift in my life. When I was young, I mean, the United States of America, right, the world I grew up in, it was just Christianity permeated the culture, right? And the world you're growing up in, Christianity's all over the place, but in many of the main institutions of our world, universities, the media, right, to some extent, some sectors in government and the corporate world and so forth, it's a post-Christian world to some extent. When you go to the university, you're gonna encounter both, right, intellectuals like you've seen here, but also intellectuals that were shaped by a post-Christian world. And so I'd really challenge you to, use good discernment. There's ways in which this sort of secular society that you live in open up the possibilities for you to live your Christian faith in a more profoundly robust way. But there's other ways in which it challenges you in ways that I just wasn't challenged when I was your age. So I really want you to face that challenge. And I honor you for spending this week here thinking through these kinds of issues, and to Jeremy for putting this together.
Maybe write down your top 3 favorite books on philosophy. That way they can check it out. I know you'll have a list of sorts, but just here and now on the whiteboard, if you can write down your favorite philosophy books. And thanks again. Really a helpful